of Tactics and Tentacles. This was inspired by what was almost a throwaway comment from me last week when we were discussing the Keep on the Borderlands dungeon crawl that that I'm a player in, the campaign that I'm a player in which one of our characters had used a potion of gaseous form in order to advance ahead of the rest of the party to free some prisoners. And I made some throwaway comment, boy, that's just like the Soviet operational maneuver detachment. Well, I butchered the term operational maneuver detachment. It's actually operational maneuver group. That's what you get for dipping back into your memory to stuff you learned 20 some odd years ago. And B, I wanted to unpack that a little more because the more I thought about it over the week, the more I realized there's some meat here. There's some really interesting concepts which could be useful for the player, in order to enhance your ability or a player's ability to survive in what I lovingly call the counter monster domain. So we're going to break down the operational maneuver group real quick, and we're going to finish up with explaining how it applies to Dungeons and Dragons or any tabletop RPG for that matter. So the operational maneuver group was originally a very specifically Russian concept. The first noted use of it was in the old Imperial Russian Army, 1877, in the Russo-Turkish War, in which a forward detachment under a general whose name escapes me, of 11,000 men, 11,000 soldiers, was sent ahead of the main body to execute some very specific missions: conduct reconnaissance, attack reserves, disrupt Turkish reconnaissance, and to seize key mountain passes in order to allow the passage of the main body. This was echoed again during the Russo-Japanese War. And I say here cavalry raid to cut Japanese comms. I mean cavalry raid more as a concept rather than a actual raid of nothing but cavalry. And I am going to address the difference between a cavalry raid and the OMG mission a little bit. So, during the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians sent a large combined arms force, again another forward detachment for I think it was the Army of Manchuria, around the Japanese left flank, and their mission was to attack the Japanese rear, to cut lines of communication, to destroy Japanese supplies, and disrupt Japanese transportations, as well as attacking any Japanese reserves. Important point here, these were both combined arms forces, and this use of combined arms in this operational maneuver group is a consistent echo throughout the Russian use of this. So by combined arms, what do I mean? I mean a force that consists of a mixed force that balances out artillery, cavalry, infantry, engineers, logistics, and other supporting arms, air defense when that became a thing, in such a way that the various elements that built up this force are mutually supporting. Give you an example. Let's say you're trying to maneuver against an enemy position and it's shooting at you. And your maneuver elements, your infantry or armor guys, are getting lit up real bad because they're getting shot at. And they can't maneuver because every time they pop up to maneuver, they get whammed. So, what do? You use your artillery to suppress the defenders. They are now stuck and stationary and unable to accurately bring fire against your maneuver element, which then maneuvers around and attacks the enemy from, flank, different direction, whatever. Point being that the action of one of the arms on the field of battle exposes the enemy to the actions of another element on the field of battle. That's what we mean by combined arms. So the Russians, they worked with this and they refined it, and a really smart Russian field marshal named, God, this one's going to be hard because it's got like 800 vowels and 400 consonants, Tukhachevsky, worked on this concept further and refined it into deep battle at the operational level. Now, here's another concept that needs a little. Actually, there's two concepts here that need a little refining and explanation. So, operational level of war is the use of campaigns in order to meet strategic objectives. It's a particular area of Russian expertise. And you'll remember a couple episodes ago I talked about Napoleon being able to think across all three levels of war simultaneously. He would win tactically to succeed operationally to achieve strategic ends. And it was, that was part of his genius, right? So the Soviets, and I flash forward because Tukhachevsky was a Soviet-era field marshal. He was particularly prominent in the 1930s before he got purged by Stalin. The Soviets really thought at the operational level, especially after their first round of ass-kicking in World War II, in the Russo-German War portion, when the Germans, who excelled at the tactical level of war and generally, normally I will say the Germans could think up to the operational level, but the Germans really ripped through them up through 41 and 42. And it wasn't until late 42 that the Soviets started turning it around. But the Russians, the Soviets, were generally thinking at the operational level. Namely, they were thinking, how do we fight this grandiose, huge campaign to achieve national objectives rather than winning individual battles? The Germans, especially later on in the war, were very good at winning individual battles. But they would lose campaigns. And then because they lost campaigns, they lost the war. Deep battle is the other thing I wanted to unpack. Deep battle is when you are attacking the enemy's rear. To quote a friend of mine who used to be in a long-range surveillance unit, we penetrate the enemy's rear because we're hard. The idea is that when you are fighting the deep battle, you are attacking and destroying or disrupting elements in the enemy's rear which are crucial to them winning the near fight. And by near fight, I mean, the frontline forces, right? You got the near fight and you got the deep fight. So the near fight is the frontline forces who are slugging it out, right? But if in the deep battle I can do things like disrupt your ability to bring up reserves, to either exploit your successes or shore up your lack thereof, or I can attack your critical command and control nodes, thus disrupting your ability to coordinate the battle, or I can destroy your logistics elements in that deep fight, then I am damaging your ability to win that near fight, and I'm opening up further gaps in your capability for anything further on in terms of both time and space. When I was a young lieutenant, we were taught, attack across the enemy's depth, right? Attack throughout the depth of their formations. You're using your close-in elements to attack their frontline forces, and then you're using your artillery or whatever, your deeper artillery to conduct the counter-battery fight, and then you're using battlefield air CAS or battlefield air interdiction to attack their reserve formations to keep them from moving up, and you're using air interdiction even further out, and there's a difference between battlefield air interdiction and air interdiction, and I'll let an Air Force doctrinal expert explain that crap because it's still beyond me, and I'm been doing this stuff for 30 years. And then you're attacking with attackums or ballistic missiles, way back in the rear, and you're disrupting the whole system all at once. Well, yeah, we kind of sucked at that. Moving on, the Russo-German War and Deep Battle. Okay, I want to bring up a couple points here. I tend to call the German, Russian, or German-Soviet portion of World War II the Russo-German War because, in my opinion, World War II is actually 3 different wars fought simultaneously, loosely connected by some of the same players, but they were actually all separate conflicts. Personally, I divided up into the Western Front, the Russo-German War, and the Pacific Campaign. And you could even go further and say there was also a separate Indian War or a South Asian War. But, at that point, you may be getting a little too parsing it down too fine there. So a couple points I wanted to bring up here. I would flip those 2 around if I had worked more on my slide deck here. So the Soviets had formed these mobile groups based upon their experiences in the early part of World War II. Namely, as they evolved their doctrine and had gone on the counteroffensive against the Germans, and the Germans refined their own defensive techniques, the Soviets began using a 3-echeloned force. They would use a break-in force of generally infantry to crack into the enemy defensive belts and defensive works. The German defensive belts and defensive works, I should be precise about. They would use a breakthrough force, which originally had been an exploitation force, to open a gap. And then they would use the OMG, or what became the OMG, they were called mobile groups back then, as the exploitation force, which would then penetrate deep into the enemy's rear to seize key terrain, isolate large enemy groupings. You remember what I was going on about a couple episodes ago when I was talking about Napoleon's maneuver sous les derrières? Very similar concept. A force that would bypass around, that would penetrate through and exploit, and end up in the enemy's rear across something they couldn't live without, namely their logistics or something like that, or a key reserve force or something like that, forcing the isolation and the destruction in detail of German forces. So how did this play out in the Cold War? Even better from the Russian perspective. So the Russians looked at the nuclear battlefield and quickly realized that the nuclear battlefield would require greater dispersal of NATO forces, their own forces as well. But they planned to operate on the nuclear battlefield in radioactive conditions and in very close proximity to nuclear weapons. The Russian assumption, though, was that NATO forces would be forced to disperse in order to prevent themselves from presenting a very rich target for either tactical or operational level nuclear devices. That would give the Operational Maneuver Group, as it was then known by, opportunities to bypass all enemy defenses and chug straight along to the NATO rear. While their main body was coming up, this OMG would be able to just slip through and chug straight for something really important. The example I cited last week was bridges, etc. Key terrain of some variety. Enemy command and control nodes, as I mentioned earlier tonight. One of the special targets they had was nuclear weapons depots, or any location where weapons of mass destruction may be stored and prepared for use. Because if you took that off the battle space, that really is a game changer. Part of the Russian fondness for this, the Soviet fondness for this, was their assumption that there was no ability for NATO to trade space for time. Now, by trading space for time, I mean this is a time-honored Russian technique. Russia is huge. Russia is bigger than anything you can think of. Russia is ginormous. The Russians traditionally have been like, yeah, go ahead and invade us, man. That's cool. That's cool. We're just going to fall back in front of you, trading space for time to build up our reserves, to generate combat power, time for you to wear yourself out, and then we're going to counterattack. Now it's time for me to pull out my little card that says tempo. Tempo, it's not just moving faster than the enemy, it means imposing the pace of events to the enemy. Tempo leads to initiative, which means you're dictating events to the enemy. So here, this is a perfect example of tempo. So the Soviets, the Russians, they did it in World War I, they did it in World War II, they would have done it again. They did it in the Napoleonic era. They will trade space, fall back, and even though the enemy may be thinking they're dictating terms, the pace of events to them, to the Russians are actually the ones who are seizing the initiative. Doesn't have to be about moving fast the enemy. It has to be about the person who's the side that's dictating events. Ha! So, to wrap this up, the Soviets used an exercise called Zapad 81 as a test bed and also as a way of overawing the Solidarity Party in Poland, because the exercise was conducted on Polish soil, in which they demonstrated a version of the OMG and this whole attacking in depth philosophy, in which airborne units were attacking enemy notional notional NATO nuclear sites. Heliborne units were landing on top of notional NATO command posts, and the operational maneuver group, which during the exercise was a tank division, as I recall, was isolating and destroying enemy reserve forces, attacking throughout the depth of the notional NATO formations in order to disrupt the whole thing all at once. So, how does this apply to D&D? For starters, I would actually reorder this again. What is your party trying to achieve? Now, one of the common problems that we run into as game masters is our parties that we're playing, or providing our genius for, their main focus is the accumulation of power. We may present them a scenario, an adventure, a campaign in which they're trying to achieve some strategic effect, like my Age of Worms campaign, where the players are trying to prevent the destruction of the world by the return of Kyos, or were trying, before they failed to watch Tactics and Tentacles often enough and got wiped. But, and really break it down, the party is trying to gain more experience, gain more power, and get more loot. That's a problem, because they don't know, their desired end state is different than what the DM thinks their desired end state should be. That's kind of an artificial differentiation there. But it's important, because if the party is just trying to go room by room and kill everything in it, they've got no need to think about attacking in depth and sending out elements to achieve specific operational or strategic objectives outside of that close-in fight. All they want to do is grind from one fight to the next, get some experience, loot the room. So if we as GMs, we as dungeon masters, game masters, whatever game we're playing, manage to provide the players with scenarios where there is an objective they need to achieve outside of just gaining experience, this will play out a lot more. It's that can be a challenge. But if you do have a scenario like that, if you're running a campaign where there are specific, operational, strategic, etc. objectives the players should be trying to meet, they need to understand what they're trying to achieve. And if I'm trying to think of the best way to put it, if there's this if there's a breakdown in communication between the game master, the dungeon master, as kind of the campaign manager, the scenario manager, and the players as the people who are in that campaign, well, maybe you guys need to have a chat. But that brings us back to, if you are trying to do that correctly, or if that's what you're trying to achieve as the party, then you need to take a look at what you need to do to achieve that end state. Now, going back to what we discussed last week, where Half-Lit Moon, recognizing that our desired end state was freeing the prisoners and getting them out of the caves of chaos alive and off back to the keep on the Borderlands. With him drinking that potion of gaseous form and, oozing and floating his way over to where the prisoners were, that was a perfect example of, on a microcosm level, at a D&D level, of an operational maneuver group. Now, however, that was very much going to have an operational level effect, because we were going to succeed in the campaign, which was going to have strategic effects at the keep, by conducting this maneuver. Now, so Half-Lit was literally attacking while the rest of the party, was kind of working their way up and doing the onesie-twosie fights along the way. He was actually attacking throughout the depth of the enemy's formation. He took the path of least resistance. Now, this could play out in other ways too. If you conduct adequate reconnaissance and you find out that there's a way to, say, bypass that room full of whatever's orcs and pop up in a room in the dungeon further in where the big bad evil guy is, well, guess what? That's the smart play, because you're not going to fritter away combat power, duking it out with a bunch of orcs early on, which means, you're not going to be casting cure spells, you're not going to be sucking down potions, you're not going to be using up your buffs, etc. Rather, you reach what is the enemy center of gravity, where you can achieve overmatch because you're fresher, and you have more combat power to bring to that point at the center of gravity. A lot of concepts kind of laid out here tonight. Some of them a little more confusing than others. I'm not sure I explained this in the clearest way possible. This is the OMG, and I'm trying to distill a decade's worth of tactical and operational and strategic level experience into 25-minute episodes, and sometimes the concepts are kind of hard to explain. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Remember, conduct your reconnaissance, bypass things you don't need to attack, identify the enemy's center of gravity, and show up with the maximum amount of power you can there. Anyway, so next week, I am going to talk about what I do to prepare for the fight. Namely, what I do as a game master to ensure that I am troubling my players as much as I can. And I will use an example of one of my, what I call decision support matrices or decision support templates, depending upon my mood, which is a translation of a army planning document that doctrinally is used to assist a commander in making decisions during an operation, hence the term decision support template. But I use it to help me as a game master make determinations about what the big bad evil guys are going to do in a particular fight. And for me, it really helps because it allows me to run these combats a lot more quickly and make my decisions as a game master or dungeon master much more quickly. So I'll go over those next week. And again, if you got any questions about what I went over, feel free to email me at drungeonmaster@gmail.com or hit me up on Twitter or through the Twitch chat or something. I don't know. Anyway, thank you, and I hope you guys had a great Easter and have a good week. Talk to you next week. Oh, before I go, we're having the final session of Gamma World Legion of Gold this Friday, and then we're taking a short hiatus before we transition over to Marvel Superheroes, which will be our next throwback game. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you next week.